Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfoud, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome, all of you. So our talk tonight is on the virtue of charity. So we've gone through faith and hope, looking at them in the Old and the New Testament, in Biblical Judaism and Catholicism, and seeing that there's a profound continuity, but yet also a tremendous and totally unexpected deepening and transformation at the same time. We've seen that with faith and with hope. For example, with faith, we saw that there was a fundamental continuity, but yet a deepening because God comes in person, made flesh. God made flesh speaks to Israel and to mankind, giving faith a much greater strength than it could ever have had if God hadn't become incarnate. Right? We saw the same thing about hope last week. We saw that Israel shares the hope of the church, but nevertheless, it was given much greater strength and solidity and explicitness through the incarnation, and above all, the passion and resurrection of Christ, because he precedes us in the glory that we hope for. And so, and the same thing will be true, we'll see tonight, that the teaching on charity is the same in the Old Testament and the New. It's the same revelation, the double commandment of love, but yet there's a deepening through the passion of Christ, and we'll see that at the end. Now, one of my goals in these talks is to aid Jews. Now, there aren't any here tonight, but the idea is to aid those who are wondering about the figure of Jesus to see precisely both this continuity and the transformation through the work of the Messiah. Right? And another goal, which again we have none here, but Messianic Jews believe in Christ as the Messiah, but they don't believe in his church. And so we want also to show that continuity between ancient Israel and the church. And then finally, of course, for all Catholics to show those same points, right? Because it builds up the faith of all of us. Okay. So let's start in now on the virtue of charity in the Old Testament, in Biblical Judaism and Catholicism. Now, two of the great glories of the Old Testament, Judaism, were, if you wanted to, there were many, but if you had to pick two, I would probably pick the revelation of the oneness of God, so monotheism, and the double commandment of love as our supreme duty to that one God. And those two teachings are intimately united. They go together. And they're even revealed together in the same biblical text, which is the text of the Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your height, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And this text is recited morning and evening by devout Jews, and in its written form, it's put in what's called the mezuzah, a little parchment rolled up and put in the doorway of every Jewish home and room in their home. And that's the first text in it. The mezuzah has a second paragraph, also from Deuteronomy chapter 11, which again commands the love of God. And it goes like this. Quote, if you will obey my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, he will give you the rain for your land in its season, etc., etc. You therefore lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes. Teach them to your children, talking of them when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. And write them upon the doorposts of your house and upon your gates. So what was it they had to write down? That there is one God, and that you have to love him with all your heart, mind, and soul. Right? That's the fundamental message of the Torah. And it's not accidental that those two truths go together. Right? Because the oneness of God is really the foundation for our duty to love him with all our heart, mind, and soul. Because it's only the recognition of God's oneness that we can see that we owe him everything. Right? Israel is in the midst of polytheistic religions, right? The religions of the people of Canaan and the entire world before Judaism. And in a polytheistic religion, there are all these different forces, these different gods that represent different benefits, and none of them can command our entire heart. Because each one's a partial force. Force of fertility, the force of rain, but none of them give being. None of them create out of love. Right? Zeus. Right? Zeus couldn't command the Greeks to love him with all their heart, mind, and soul. Because he's one of many. And even as being one of many, he's not absolutely good. On the contrary, he's an adulterer. And he's a pedophile. If you read the Greek mythology, right, he rapes Ganymede, a young boy. He rapes all kinds of maidens. Right? So the commandment of the love for God would be absurd in the context of polytheism. Right? And that was typical of the ancient peoples. And so the double commandment of love, the commandment to love God with your heart, mind, and soul, was new in the world with Judaism, even though it's something so basic, right, that it's written on our conscience. And by the way, the same thing is true today in New Age religiosity. Right? In New Age, people seek higher power and forces, cosmic forces, and no cosmic force could merit the full love of our heart. Right? Only the one God. Okay. Now, the Old Testament equally contains the second half of the great commandment of love, fraternal love for our neighbor. Right? So there's love for our, God with our heart, mind, and soul, and love for our neighbor as ourselves. And that's contained in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And again, you see the connection. Right? We're to love our neighbors ourselves precisely because God is the Lord, the one God, and we're made in his image, which means my neighbor is made in his image as well. Right? So that the precept for love of neighbor is founded, right, receives its foundation in the precept to love God with our heart, mind, and soul. Right? And that's why God puts that, I am the Lord. Love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord. This chapter of Leviticus, by the way, gives a summary of the law, kind of fleshes out the Ten Commandments and adds details of how to put them in practice. And all of these details are consequences of that fundamental precept to love our neighbor as ourselves. I'll just read a little section from this. It's very practical. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field to its very border, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. Now, that's very curious. Why does the Lord command that? Because by leaving the gleanings and by leaving the edges, there was something left for the poor. And so the poor could go. That belonged to the poor. And again, you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner, the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not remain with you all night until the morning. So if you have an employee, you have to pay him right away. Right? You can't wait till the next day. Again, it's simply a consequence of fraternal charity. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. Right? So neither on the one side nor the other. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go up and down as a slander among your people. You shall not stand forth against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason with your neighbor, lest you bear sin because of him. And so if someone does you a wrong, right, you're not supposed to bear it in your heart, but you're supposed to tell him, confront him, and to make peace. Right? You shall not take vengeance or bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Right? It's a great text. And so you can see everything that precedes is all a consequence of the final verse. Right? All of those other things are simply ways of putting in practice loving your neighbor as yourself. And that's true of all the commandments in the Torah that deal with our neighbor, right? Or deal with justice. Okay. Now we know that the Ten Commandments were written on 2 tablets. Right? God wrote them on 2 tablets. That's a curious detail. And the Christian tradition sees in those 2 tablets the precepts with regard to God and the precepts with regard to neighbor. I'm not sure if that's in the Jewish tradition as well. Do you know? Probably it is. And so we can see that our fundamental duties are basically 2. To love God with our heart, mind, and soul. That would be the first 3 commandments. To have only one God. To not to take his name in vain. In other words, to reverence him. And to keep his day holy. In other words, to keep a day reserved for the worship of God alone. Right? And then the other commandments concern love of neighbor. And so all the 10 commandments derive from the double commandment of love. Now the Gospels record for us a conversation between Jesus and a scribe, who was one of the Pharisees, during the Passion Week. So after Christ has come into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and yet before his Passion. And the context of this this conversation is that first the Sadducees have tried to tempt him about the resurrection, and we talked about that last week, because they didn't believe in the resurrection. And then after the Sadducees were rebuked by our Lord for their disbelief, the Pharisees came to him and asked him a question about love. Right? And so the question was simply, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Right? And we all know the answer. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. And so it's very interesting that he says the second commandment is like the first, in the sense that there's the same reason for loving our neighbor as for loving God. Right? Precisely because our neighbor is made in his image. Right? It's his creature. Now, in Mark, it's interesting, we have the same conversation, and Mark adds another detail. It starts in the same way, but the scribe in Mark's account agrees with Jesus, and he repeats it. So the scribe says, "You're right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one. There is no other than he. And to love him with all the heart, with all the understanding, with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself is much more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he answered wisely, right, he says, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And that's very interesting because it shows us there's a fundamental agreement on this point between Jesus and the Pharisees. Right? They held the exact same thing. And Jesus praises him, saying he's not far from the kingdom of God, and the scribe praises Jesus in return. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a different conversation which is practically identical, but apparently in a different occasion, as Jesus was coming to Jerusalem for the Passion. Again, the same thing. A lawyer, a scribe, came up to Jesus and says, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus puts the question back to him. And the scribe answers him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And so in this case, it's the scribe who gives the double commandment, and not Jesus. And Jesus says, "You have answered right. Do this and live." However, the dialogue continues, well, who is my neighbor? Right? And Jesus answers with the parable of the Good Samaritan. So that was the way of introducing the parable of the Good Samaritan, to show the full universality of that commandment. Okay, but the key point here is that there's a fundamental agreement. And it's interesting that the Talmud contains a similar story about the Rabbi Hillel, who lived before Jesus, the generation before. They probably overlapped. And the story goes like this. A heathen came up to the two great rabbis of the day, which was Shammai and Hillel. And first he asked Shammai to explain to him the Torah while he stood on one foot. And Shammai thought that was an insolent question, and he chased him away with a stick. The same man went to Hillel, and Hillel took him at his word. And he says, "Okay, I can do it." He says, "What is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah, and all the rest is commentary." Right? Basically what he's saying is the precept of fraternal charity is the whole of the law, and all the rest is, in a sense, fleshing it out, right? Making it concrete. All the other 612 commandments. Actually, it's not quite true, is it? Because it leaves out the primary precept of the love of God, right? So the way it's answered in the gospel is really more perfect, right? The real answer is the double commandment, not simply the commandment of fraternal charity. But in any case, a similar story is told of another famous rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, who was the rabbi at the time of the second revolt under the Emperor Hadrian, 100 years after the death of Jesus. And this rabbi is quoted as saying, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," is the encompassing principle of the Torah. Right? That principle, that precept of fraternal charity, encompasses the whole of the law. And there's another famous saying in the Talmud: "Whoever destroys the life of one of the sons of Adam, it is as if he had destroyed the entire world." And so the idea is that every man has a dignity that's uncountable, that can't be measured. So destroying the life of an innocent human being, in a sense, is like destroying the whole world, because the innocent human being is the image of God. Or any. And likewise in the positive, whoever preserves the life of a single human being, it is as if he has preserved the entire world. That's a beautiful saying. And throughout the Jewish tradition, we always find that primacy of charity. For example, the Hasidic movement was founded by a great rabbi known as the Baal Shem Tov. And he made the precept of charity be the principal service of the devout Jew. And service here really means work, but it also means sacrifice. It means offering to God. And so the principal offering is charity. And his disciple, for example, said that one must love the perfectly wicked just as the perfectly righteous. Right? So very similar again to love your enemy and to forgive them. Right? So there's perfect harmony on this point in terms of teaching. The double commandment is the center of the Torah, and Jesus comes not to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Now, it's often said that frequently you hear the Old Testament is a religion of fear and the New Testament of love, as if there was a radical, dichotomy, fear and love. Right? And from what we've just seen, it's totally false. Right? It's not true at all. And in fact, the two are complementary, both in the Old and in the New Testament, both in Judaism and in Catholicism. fear of the Lord and love of the Lord complement each other. They go together. And you can't ultimately have one properly without the other. Because fear of the Lord really means reverence of the Lord. And that comes from recognizing who He is and who we are. And if we recognize that He's the Lord who's created me out of nothing, well then I have to revere Him and in a sense fear Him, meaning recognize that He holds all destiny in His hands. And therefore His will is the will that governs the universe and has to govern my life as well. Right? That's what it is to fear Him and to recognize that there's a judgment. And that judgment depends on whether I live in accordance with His will or not. Right? And so Christianity doesn't abolish the fear of the Lord. On the contrary, what does Jesus say? We saw it last week a little bit. When Jesus speaks about reward and punishment, it's not as if He takes them away, but He deepens them. He makes them more clearly eternal. Right? Judaism already had it, but He very explicitly makes judgment concern our eternal destiny. And that doesn't serve to lessen the fear of the Lord, right? But to increase it. Rightly understood, not to see God as a tyrant, right? But simply to recognize that He has in His hands eternal happiness or frustration, and it depends on our correspondence with Him. Okay, so fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom in both the Old and the New Testament, in both Judaism and Catholicism. There's a beautiful text from the Zohar, which is one of the great Jewish mystical treatises from the Middle Ages. And in this text, it speaks of three kinds of fears, three ways of understanding the fear of the Lord, of which only one is correct. He says, on the one hand, there's a man who fears the Holy One, blessed be He, in order that he may have temporal benefits. For example, in order that his children may live and not die, or lest he be punished in his body or his possessions. And so he's in constant fear of God. Right? This is evidently not the genuine fear of the Lord. Or another man fears the Holy One, blessed be He, because he's afraid of punishment in the other world and the tortures of hell. And this, likewise, is not genuine fear. It's not bad, right? We ought to fear hell. But it's not the pinnacle, it's not the culmination of what's meant by fear of the Lord. The genuine type, says this Jewish text, is that which makes a man fear his master because he is the mighty ruler. In other words, because he's God, the rock and foundation of all the worlds, before whom everything else is as nothing. That's very beautiful. And so fear of the Lord is the reverence and awe that we ought to have for God on account of His sovereignty. And that's a sovereignty also over us. Right? And it's in no way incompatible with love of the Lord, but is presupposed by love. Right? So we're to love God above all things precisely because He is who He is, the supreme good, the creator, and the rock on which the world is based. And just for that exact same reason, and our supreme benefactor, from whom we've received everything, right? And for that same reason, we have to fear Him, in the sense of revere Him. If we didn't fear offending God as the greatest of evils, could we say that we loved Him above all things? Right? You wouldn't. See, to love God above all things means to hold offending Him as the greatest of all evils, and therefore something to be feared. The principal thing to be feared. Right? The principal thing to be feared isn't the punishment of hell, right? But it's offending God, which merits such a punishment. So the love and fear of God go together. I've cited a text here from one of the Hasidic authors, Jewish authors. The love and fear of God has to do with the heart. That a man's heart should constantly burn in love and awe of God. Okay. Now there's a corollary of this primacy of charity. If love is the great commandment that sums up the law, it's clear that our salvation will depend on fulfilling it. Right? So the primacy of charity shows us also that we're saved through charity. And Jesus says that explicitly. He says, "Do this and you shall live," to the scribe who said, who gave the double commandment. Do this and you shall live. So salvation depends on carrying out the double precept of love, at least in the heart. And so it follows that man is not saved by faith alone. In other words, the Protestant idea of salvation by faith alone is ultimately unscriptural. Right? It goes against the primary moral revelation of the Old and New Testament, which is the primacy of love. So the Catholic doctrine is that we're saved by faith, yes, but by faith, hope, and charity together. Right? All together. Because faith engenders hope, and hope engenders charity. And that fullness is what by which we're justified before God. And we see this throughout the Old and New Testament. One of the great examples is Matthew chapter 25. And Jesus is speaking explicitly about the Last Judgment and the criterion by which the judge, which is he himself, shall judge all souls. And he says, we've heard it 100 times, when the Son of Man comes in glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit in his glorious throne, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And then he goes on to say the criterion. He will say to those at his right hand, "Come, O blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." And they answer, "Lord, when did we do this?" And he says, "If you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me." Right? And then the criterion for condemnation is exactly the same. "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me no drink," etc., etc. "When, Lord? Truly, as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me." And the one goes into punishment, and the other into eternal life. Right? So you can see that the criterion for salvation is the precept of charity. Right? It's as clear as, and it's the double precept, because, and precisely through the exercise of fraternal charity, we show our love of God the Father. Right? Seeing Christ in our neighbor as the motive for doing fraternal charity. And so that's the two commandments together. Another example is the dialogue of Jesus with the rich young man. And so the rich young man says, "What do I have to do to merit eternal life?" And Jesus answers in perfect harmony with the Old Testament, "If you would enter into life, keep the commandments." Which commandments? Right? And he just goes on to list the commandments of the second tablet, the commandments of fraternal charity. And he sums it up, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And St. Paul teaches the same. Luther always quoted St. Paul in this regard, but it's St. Paul who says, if I have all prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I do not have charity, I am nothing. Right? So faith, hope, and charity abide. But the greatest of these is charity. Right? That's the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13. Of course, it's true. The charity by which we're saved isn't a human work. Right? It's not simply human philanthropy or doing good. It's a supernatural gift that we can't do by ourselves, that isn't in us, and which presupposes first faith and then hope. Right? So the charity by which we're saved is a charity built on faith and hope. Right? So we're saved by faith, hope, and charity. What is charity? All right, so we've been talking about all this time, and we didn't ever say what it was. So now I'm going to burden you with the philosophical discourse on what is charity. And basically what I'm going to do is follow Benedict's encyclical on charity. And in that encyclical, he speaks about two aspects of love. He speaks about eros and agape. So I'll see if I can explain that. In every love, we can always identify two aspects. There's always willing some good, desiring some good, and a person for whom we desire it. Right? So to love is to will the good for someone. Right? And so in that willing the good for someone, there's these two aspects, desiring some good and a person for whom we will the good. Right? And that's where we get these eros and agape. For example, I love my mother. So I will the good for my mother. I will happiness for my mother. And so there's a love of desire for happiness, and there's a personal love, which we can call agape, or love of benevolence in English, love of benevolence for the person for whom I will the good. Likewise, if I will something maybe disordered, if I love wine or drugs, again, there are two things that I'm loving. I'm willing this good, which is a false good perhaps, and there's a person that I'm willing it for, who I love, which is myself. And so St. Thomas Aquinas and the other medieval philosophers speak of these two kinds of love as love of desire and love of benevolence. So love of desire would be a love for some object, and love of benevolence is love for a person for whom I will the good. Right? Or we could also call it need love, love of desire, and oblative love, a love of self-giving, which would be love of benevolence. Right? Now in English, we've got, in this case, English is usually a rich language, but in philosophical terms, English is usually poor. I don't know why. And so we just have this one word, love. Whereas Greek was a richer language, and it has three words, of which two are significant here, eros and agape. Eros would be love of desire, and that's where we get the word erotic from. But it doesn't necessarily mean sexual desire. It could mean love of desire for any good in Greek. And then agape is this oblative love, a love of self-giving, a love of donation, a love of gift of self. Now, eros isn't always bad, right? It's very important. It's only bad if it's disordered. If the thing that I'm loving is not truly good for me, that's when it's bad. But eros, meaning a love of desire, if the thing that I'm loving is very good, for example, truth, or virtue, or union with God, then eros is a very good thing. Okay? But nevertheless, agape is higher, because agape is loving something for its own sake, whereas eros is loving something for me, or perhaps for my family, or for somebody else. But it's not for its own sake. Okay? Only agape is loving another person for their own sake. And normally in our relations with other people, our love starts out as a kind of eros, a love of need. Right? Think of children with regard to their parents. They love their parents because they absolutely need their parents. But that grows into a love of benevolence because they come through the need love to loving their parents for their own sake. Right? Or at least we should. Right? And the same thing obviously goes for love of our spouse. Right? It always will have some element of eros, of desire, of need. But if it just stays there, it's immature. It has to blossom into a love of self-giving. Okay? Now, if that's true with another person, obviously it will be true likewise with God. Right? So we can pose that question. What kind of love is the love that we're commanded to have for God in the first commandment? Right? In that commandment to love Him with all our heart, mind, and soul. Right? It's clearly going to be agape, a love of self-giving. It's not that eros is bad with regard to God. We also have to have a need love with regard to God, right? Because the fact is, we need Him, and He completes us. So it would be crazy not to have love of desire for God, right? That would be unreasonable, because it's good for us to desire Him. It's supremely good. And in fact, that's the virtue of hope that we looked at last week. Right? The virtue of hope is ultimately a love of desire for God as our ultimate happiness. Right? A love of desire for union with God. So it's very, very good, love of desire for God. But nevertheless, it's not the highest love. And it's not really what we're commanded in that first commandment. And so what we're commanded, to love God with all our heart, mind, and soul, is to love Him with the love of agape. And you can see this in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and in the I have to check that, scratch that. You see that in the New Testament, that the word used for this love is agape and not eros. Right? So it's very clear that the love that Jesus is speaking about is agape. And likewise, and that's why in English, the word charity, originally, properly speaking, was chosen to have charity would be precisely that oblative love for God. In other words, the supernatural love for God as distinct from other loves. Right? The word love is, Benedict speaks about that in his encyclical. It's one of these words that has so many levels and so many meanings. We wonder sometimes why it's good that it has so many meanings. And actually, there's a reason for this. The fact that love has so many meanings is because it serves as a kind of ladder to lead us up from what we have most experience of to God, to the highest form of love. Right? And then the word charity is reserved for that. Nevertheless, in English today, we usually associate the word charity with philanthropy, right, which is its consequence. Now, the love of charity for God, agape, isn't even any form of benevolence. It's a special form. It's a mutual love of benevolence. And that is friendship. Okay, so friendship, even for the philosophers, even for Aristotle, friendship is a love of benevolence. In other words, we love a person for their own sake, but it has this property of being mutual. And in addition, it has the property of being built on a sharing of life. For example, suppose I love someone in China, and they love me. Somehow, I don't know. But there's no sharing of life. There's just some kind of mutual admiration. That's not truly friendship, right? Because friendship requires that you live with the friend, at least in some, as much as you can. Right? And that you have to share a life and share interests. And that's why in friendship, it's so important that there be something shared. There be a shared mission, or shared beliefs, shared convictions, the shared task of raising children. Right? That's what bonds of friendship. So we might ask, well, can there be friendship in the true sense between God and man? How could there be a sharing of life between man and God? And the answer is, well, without grace, there couldn't be. But that's precisely what grace is. In the gift of sanctifying grace, which we receive in baptism, what's given to us is a sharing in the life of God. We can't see it, it's invisible. But that's what sanctifying grace does. It enables us to know Him as He knows Himself through faith, and to love Him as He loves Himself. And that's the gift of charity. And it shares also somehow sanctifying grace, mysteriously, it's a mystery that can't be properly explained, enables us to share the divine life, even though we remain creatures. And so grace is a tremendous mystery, and it's what makes possible charity. And that's why you can't have charity as an abiding, in an abiding way without being in a state of grace. If you're in a state of mortal sin, you don't have charity that abides in you. Right? This is something that I think so many of us have forgotten. We think of charity as somehow something natural. No. It's above human nature. Okay, so it's a mutual love, and obviously God has taken the first step. He's loved us first. And on the basis of Him loving us first, we can love Him back with charity. Right? If He didn't take the first step, we couldn't do it. Now, you can see mortal sin. We said mortal sin excludes charity. And I think it's easy to see that. Because what happens in a mortal sin is that I prefer something else to God. Right? Whatever it is that causes me to sin. If I steal some significant amount of money from my neighbor, I've preferred that money to God's law. And therefore, it's not true that I love God above all things. Right? And that's true in every single mortal sin that happens. And so charity is incompatible with mortal sin and presupposes that God has forgiven our mortal sins. And so they happen at the exact same time. God forgives our sin, for example, in the sacrament of penance, and at the same time, He infuses charity into our hearts. Right? And those two things are inseparable. So charity always includes contrition for sin. And perfect charity includes perfect contrition. And perfect contrition is precisely that sorrow for sin, precisely because it offends the loved one. There's imperfect contrition, which is ultimately for my sake. Right? In other words, imperfect contrition is being sorry that I've sinned because it means I'll go to hell. So I'm loving myself there, which is good. It's healthy self-love. But it's not charity with respect to God. It's charity with respect to myself. Okay? So perfect contrition is charity with respect to God. Sorrow for having sinned because it offends He who I love more than myself. And how could I love Him more than myself? Somebody might ask. Well, because He is more than myself. In other words, it would be crazy to love myself even equally with God, because I'm a speck of dust and He's God. Right? He's the source of every goodness, and I'm just a participating little speck that shares in a tiny, infinitesimal, infinitely small share in His goodness. So it doesn't make any sense to love God equally with myself. Right? It's only reasonable to love Him infinitely above myself. Okay. Let's look now at the motives for the love of God. Obviously, the principal motive for loving God is knowing who He is and what He's done for us. And therefore, that's why we said that charity always presupposes faith. If I don't know who God is, I won't be able to love Him as He deserves to be loved. Because you can't love what you don't know. Right? And we see this in our human relations as well. Knowing the goodness of a friend helps us to love them. And so that means that if we have an insufficient knowledge of God through not having the true faith, our ability to love Him will gravely suffer, right? Depending on how incorrect or insufficient our knowledge of God is. So, for example, if you grew up a pagan, Greek, and your knowledge of God was that He was a collection of warring and adulterous deities, you wouldn't be able to love Him with your heart, mind, and soul, right? As we said before. Unless you knew better, right? Like Socrates or Plato. Even though they were pagans, they knew better through philosophy. But their pagan religion didn't help them. Right? And the same thing would be even more true if you grew up, say, in the Aztec religion or the Canaanite religion, where the people thought that God asked for the bloody sacrifice of human hearts, right? Ripped out of the breast of innocent children. Right? How could you love such a God? Or if you thought that God was impersonal, simply the force behind the world, how could you love God with your heart, mind, and soul? Right? Or even, what if you thought that God was a God that could send people to hell without giving them sufficient grace to be saved? That's what Jansenism taught. in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it's really what Calvin taught in the original Calvinism. Right? How could you love a God that would do such a thing? So it's very important to have the right faith in order to be able to have charity. In that encyclical on charity, Benedict poses the question, how can God command us to love him? Right? Because he does. That's the first and greatest commandment. How can he command love? Because somebody might think, well, love is a feeling. Love is something that you have spontaneously. Yeah. And of course the answer is love isn't just a feeling. Right? On one level, love is a feeling, on our sense level. But love is also an act of the will. And it lies in our power to love with our will. Right? We can't cause the feeling by our will. But what we can do is will to love one who merits love. Right? And we can do this, for example, with our spouse and our children, with our neighbor, even when he's wronged us. We can will to love them, even though we feel something contrary at times. Right? And so the same thing goes for God. It's just that with regard to God, there are all kinds of motives for loving him which are immeasurable. And so let's look at that now. Right? Again, the reason for loving God, the reason why God can command it, is because he's infinitely lovable. And that's simply because of who he is. And so it's enough for us to want it, right? And we've done it. And so what are the, let's look at what are the motives. The first motive for love of God is creation. So recognizing that we're his creature, and that every good that we received comes from his hand. Right? That's the first and most basic motive for loving God, which is every person in all human history has at their in their hand to do. And that's where the great importance of the creation account in Genesis. Right? It shows us the principal reason, the first reason for loving God is the fact that he's created us good. Nevertheless, God gave to Israel a second reason for loving him, and we can see why it's fitting that he would do so, because even though creation ought to be in and of itself a sufficient motive for loving God, the fact is that the mind is weakened by sin and the presence of evil in the world, and many people find it difficult to recognize him behind that. In any case, God gave to ancient Israel a second reason to love him, and that was the fact that he elected them gratuitously to be his people. Right? That he chose them among all the peoples of the earth to be separated out unto him, to be his inheritance, to be his adopted son. And so the whole event of Exodus is the second motive for Israel to love God. Right? So the creation and then Exodus. And for example, Deuteronomy chapter 7 says this very beautifully. You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession. Out of all the peoples that are on the face of the earth, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love upon you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples. But it's because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath which he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh the king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God who keeps his covenant and his steadfast love with those who obey him to 1,000 generations. Unquote. And so Israel is to love God because God loved them first by electing them. And he says if they keep his covenant, there will be a royal priesthood and a holy people. And so you see that God's gratuitous love has to call forth a response on Israel's part. Right? He picks them out, and that's precisely the covenant, that on account of that gratuitous election, they have to obey him and love him in response. Okay, and that's the covenant. Because God has freely loved Israel first, they have to love him with their heart, mind, and soul, and their neighbor as themselves. It's interesting, by the way, to see that the same text is given in the New Testament as well by St. Peter in his first letter. He says to the church, the exact same words, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." And he's citing Exodus chapter 19. God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were no people, right, all the pagans, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Okay, let's shift now, and we'll look at the New Testament. And just think about this for a minute. If the double commandment of love is the principal duty of Israel, it would be fitting that the Messiah would perfect that. Right? In other words, what should be the principal thing that the Messiah would do for Israel? Would it be to, reestablish the Davidic kingship? To reestablish temporal sovereignty? No. It ought to be to teach them the double commandment of love in a new way and to give them the power, that means the grace, to put it into practice. Right? That's what one ought to expect if one was thinking rightly about the Messiah and his task. And how would the Messiah perfect Israel in love? Now, that's a good question. It couldn't be merely teaching, because Moses already did a good job of laying down the double commandment. Right? So it couldn't be teaching, it would have to be example. Okay? But what kind of example could it be? Right? The martyrs have given their lives. It would have to be something greater than the Maccabees or the prophets. Okay, so it would be a super eminent example of heroic salvific love, but also giving Israel the grace to put it in practice. And we said that since sin separates us from God, it would also have to be the forgiveness of sin. Right? And of course, that's exactly what we find in the Passion of Christ. All of those things. It's the perfect example of all love, and at the same time, it's the blotting away of all sin. And that merits for us the grace to put the commandments, and above all the commandment of love, into practice. Okay, so Christ's passion and cross perfectly fulfills what Israel needs, and mankind as well, to do the double commandment. Okay, so first and foremost, the Passion of Christ shows us how much God loves us. Okay, so it gives us a motive for loving him that's greater than the other two that were given to Israel, creation and the Exodus. Okay, so the Passion of Christ, once we recognize in faith that the Messiah is God made man, right? That the Messiah is the Son of God, the Passion of Christ shows us that God not only loved us so as to create us, he not only loved us so as to call us out of Egypt, right? But he loved us to the point of shedding every drop of blood for us. Right? And again, that's something that Israel could never have expected, that no human being could ever have dreamed of, that God would try to win our love for him by becoming man precisely so that he could shed his blood for each one of us, right? As if we were the only ones who were created. And when you think about it, how much did it cost God to create us? Nothing, right? He said, fiat, let it be. And the world was created. How much did it cost him to recreate us? His blood, his life. The greatest sufferings that could possibly be imagined. That's what it cost him, right? And so that serves as a stimulus to love that has no equal. And in fact, nothing could be imagined that could be equal to it. St. Thomas talks about this in the Summa of Theology. He poses the question whether it was fitting that Christ die on the cross, whether the Passion of Christ was fitting, and he asked the question whether perhaps God could have saved us in some other way better. Right? It's a good question. Obviously the answer will be whatever God chose to do is the best, but it's good to think about it, why this is the best way. Right? And the answer is what we've just said. He says that the Passion of Christ perfectly realizes everything we need for our salvation. And it's not just one way, but it combines two principal things. The first is deliverance from sin by the fact that he offers the sacrifice of the cross for all the sins of the world. And the second, he says, is that by means of Christ's passion, man knows how much God loves him and is thereby stirred to love him in return. And it's precisely there that the perfection of human salvation is found. Right? As St. Paul says, God commends his love for us in this, that when we were still sinners, he gave his life for us. And Jesus told this to Nicodemus when he was after he explained baptism. He says, God so loved the world as to give his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him may not perish, but have life everlasting. John 3:16. God could simply tell us that he loved us, right? But seeing is believing. And so he shows us his love for us on the cross. And later in the Gospel of John chapter 12, verse 32, just before the Last Supper, he says, when I'm lifted up from the earth, I will attract all things to myself. So he's saying, when I'm lifted up on the cross, that's when I will attract all hearts. Right? And the reason is obvious, because lifted up on the cross, we see his love for us, and that's what excites us to love him in return. Okay, so the cross is the principal motive for conversion. And by conversion here, I mean a lifelong process of turning our heart to God. Right? Because conversion isn't just something that happens once at the beginning, but it's precisely the task of the Christian life. Sometimes people speak about a second conversion, this continual conversion. A beautiful example, by the way, of this second conversion is given by St. Teresa of Avila. She talks about it in her autobiography. She had received great graces, become a Carmelite, and received great graces of prayer, but fell into a state of lukewarmness, a state of spiritual, she describes it as mediocrity. Obviously, she was still on a high level. But nevertheless, lukewarmness in comparison to what was to happen afterwards. Right? And she was aroused from it. She was in that state, she says, for 20 years or 18 years. And she was aroused from it by one day having an encounter with a beautiful image of Christ crucified. She says, one day I entered the oratory and I saw an image representing Christ sorely wounded. And it was so conducive to devotion, when I looked at it, I was deeply moved to see him thus. So well did it picture what he suffered for us. And so great was my distress when I thought how ill I had repaid him for those wounds, I felt as if my heart were breaking. And I threw myself down beside him, shedding floods of tears, and begging him to give me strength once and for all, so that I might not offend him. And from that time, I began to improve, she says. What a beautiful text. And it shows us the great importance of meditation on the cross, which is one of the principal things, practice devotion during Lent. Right? It's to meditate more frequently on the Passion of Christ. And it also shows the importance of having images of the cross publicly displayed. Right? Because they're a constant reminder of God's love for us and its inconceivable extent. Right? It's not something that we ought to hide away out of fear of offending other people. Right? It's precisely the greatest sign of God's love for mankind. For example, the Jehovah's Witnesses and others, they protest against displaying the crucifix because they think it's somehow a shameful thing. And the Mormons as well. Right? But when you think of, say, shameful because it's it's a crime. So why would you want to put up on your wall the image of mankind's crime? Well, that's not what it represents, right? It represents the greatest act of love of all of history and of all conceivable history. And so therefore, it's something that you would naturally want to treasure and display. In previous talk, I think I mentioned the Rabbi Israel Zoli, the chief rabbi of Rome, converted to Catholicism in 1945, and the beginning of his conversion was some 40 years earlier, when he first saw a crucifix in the house of a schoolmate of his, a Catholic schoolmate. And he kept that question on who was this crucified man? Was he the Messiah who died for me or not? He didn't know, but he kept that question, right? And it bore its fruit little by little. In St. Ignatius' spiritual exercises, he starts off the very first exercise, the first meditation, ends by imagining the crucifix in front of us, imagining not the crucifix, imagining Christ on the cross in front of us, and looking at him, thinking, what have I done for Christ? What am I doing right now for Christ? And what ought I to do for Christ? Seeing him so nailed to the cross, to contemplate whatever is suggested to my mind. Right? In other words, the cross is the great motive for conversion. In one of the Psalms is a beautiful line, what shall I render to the Lord for all his bounty to me? And in the light of the cross, we can rephrase it. Right? What shall I render to the Lord for all the blood he has shed for me? There's a sonnet, a Spanish sonnet from the 16th century, we don't know who wrote it, which speaks about how the cross is the greatest motive for love. It says, I am not moved to love you, my God, that I might hope in promised heaven to dwell. Nor am I moved by fear of pain in hell, to turn from sin and follow where you try. You move me, Lord, broken beneath the rod, or stretched out on the cross, as nails compel your hand to twitch. It moves me that we sell to mockery and death your precious blood. It is, O Christ, your love which moves me so, that my love rests not on a promised prize, nor holy fear on thread of endless woe. It is not milk and honey, but the flow of blood from blessed wounds before my eyes, that waters my buried soul and makes it grow. The poet doesn't mean to say that we ought not to be moved to love God by the promise of heaven, right, or the fear of hell. Right? Those are valid motives. What he's saying is that's not the principal motive. Right? The principal motive ought to be the fact that he became man so that he could shed his blood for love of us. Right? That's the principal motive. And at the same time, the Passion of Christ is the great incentive, the great stimulus for fraternal charity. Right? Just as it's the greatest stimulus for love of God above all things, likewise, it stimulates us to love our neighbor as ourselves, because we see what Christ did for our neighbor. He shed all his blood for my neighbor, just as he has for myself. Right? Even if my neighbor is a heinous sinner, he still shed all his blood for him. Right? And so now, after Christ's passion, the commandment of fraternal charity takes on a new form. And Jesus tells that to his disciples in the Last Supper. He speaks of a new commandment, which is similar to the old commandment. The newness is the motive. So he says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. In other words, as he's about to do on the cross. Greater love has no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Right? So what greater model could there be for fraternal charity than the love of God made man shedding his blood, right, for my neighbor? And so we can see that the Passion of Christ is really the capstone. It's not in any way in contradiction to the heritage of Israel, but it's the capstone of all the moral teaching that Israel received.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfoud. Good day.